Okay, let's unpack this. We are tearing open the file on perhaps the most enduring, most volatile, and strategically consequential rivalry of the last, 75 years?
At least. Yeah.
The relationship between the United States and the Russian Federation.
Mhm.
And this isn't just history class stuff. This is the dynamic that, it dictates the price of oil, the stability of Europe, and the trajectory of nuclear arms control right now, today.
It's a massive topic, and it's one that constantly generates just so much noise and political heat. So our mission in this deep dive is, I think, really crucial. We are synthesizing your sources, and it's a huge stack covering the history, politics, military, economics, all of it.
Right.
And we're using neutral data. We're talking organizations like the UN, the World Bank, and, respected geopolitical analysts to give you a factual, actionable understanding of this global power struggle.
We want to cut through the rhetoric. We know you follow this topic, so we aren't here to, define basic concepts. Our goal is to dive deep into the implications of the facts. We want you to understand the world through a balanced lens. It's about analyzing power structures, not cheering for a team.
Exactly. We're looking at the tools used and, more importantly, the consequences of their use.
And to really understand the tension today, we have to start where it all began. And that's not with animosity, but with a temporary, very pragmatic alliance that dissolved almost instantly. It seems almost unbelievable now, but the U.S. and the Soviet Union were close allies during World War II. They were fighting shoulder to shoulder against Nazi Germany.
They were, but the sources are crystal clear on this. Once that common enemy was defeated in 1945, the cooperative spirit just vanished. I mean, in a flash.
Why so fast, though?
The dissolution was, I'd say it was inevitable. The only thing holding them together was that immediate existential threat of Hitler. Once he was gone, the fundamental ideological incompatibility just roared back to the surface.
And that became the defining feature.
It became everything. The world immediately fractured. On one side, you had the U.S. championing liberal democracy, free market capitalism, individual liberty. And on the other, the Soviet Union was aggressively promoting communist expansion, centralized control, and state planning.
And that schism, that's what gave birth to the Cold War. It wasn't, a hot war with direct combat between Moscow and Washington, but it was this period of over 4 decades.
40 plus years.
From the late 1940s all the way to 1991. And it was just defined by tension, intense competition, and this pervasive fear of global conflict.
And that competition was fought on every possible front. I mean, you saw massive military buildups, of course, but also this intense espionage.
Ew.
The sources detail how agencies like the KGB and the CIA basically created the modern spy novel,
Right.
And then there was this relentless campaign to secure influence over newly decolonized nations across Asia, Africa, Latin America. Every single political dispute on the planet, no matter how small, it became a proxy battleground.
And these divisions were formalized pretty quickly through these huge military alliances. The U.S. spearheaded the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was designed as a collective defense structure.
And the Soviet countermove was, of course, the Warsaw Pact. But the sources really emphasized that these weren't just military treaties, they were ideological and economic blocs. They forced the world into a zero-sum game.
A victory for one was a defeat for the other.
Exactly. Any gain for them was a loss for us, and vice versa. And that created this incredibly high-stakes environment in flashpoint locations like Berlin, Korea, and, of course, Cuba.
And, well, you can't talk about this era without talking about the nuclear edge. Both sides poured just unthinkable resources into the arms race, producing thousands upon thousands of thermonuclear weapons. The world basically lived under the very real daily threat that a single miscalculation could lead to planetary annihilation.
And the flashpoint that just crystallizes that fear, the one our sources all point to, is the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. We're talking about a 13-day standoff. Soviet missiles discovered just 90 miles off the U.S. coast.
90 miles, it's just hard to even imagine.
The U.S. implemented a naval quarantine. They called it a quarantine, not a blockade, for legal reasons. And the internal documents from that time, they're terrifying. They show that some U.S. military leaders, including generals on the Joint Chiefs, were advocating for a direct military strike on the missile sites.
Which would have almost certainly triggered a full-scale nuclear exchange.
Almost certainly. It was a terrifying, unbelievably tense moment where, thankfully, rational actors on both sides managed to step back from the abyss, and the outcome was the creation of what many analysts now call a kind of paradoxical stability.
Explain that paradox.
What's so fascinating here is precisely that. The sheer scale of the potential destruction created this strange but functional doctrine of mutually assured destruction. You know it as AD.
Right.
MAD basically meant that if one nation launched a first strike, the other would, without fail, launch a devastating retaliatory strike. So since neither nation could actually win a nuclear war, the weapons themselves fundamentally changed their purpose.
They became tools of deterrence, not warfighting assets.
Exactly. And that concept, it still underpins the entire U.S.-Russia strategic military dynamic today, even with far fewer warheads in the arsenals.
The rivalry also played out symbolically and nowhere more dramatically than in the heavens, right? The space race.
Oh, absolutely. It was a propaganda war disguised as science. The Soviet Union scored this massive psychological victory in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik.
The first artificial satellite.
And it sent shockwaves through the West. It showed the world that the communist system could, in fact, produce superior rocket technology. It was a direct challenge.
A huge wake-up call for the U.S.
A massive one. The sources detail how President Kennedy just dramatically increased funding and national commitment to space exploration, which ultimately led to the U.S. winning the race to put a man on the moon with Apollo 11 in 1969.
One small step for man.
And it was a clear global demonstration of U.S. technological and economic superiority. It was a soft power victory of epic scale.
And then, the system that defined nearly 50 years of global tension just dramatically imploded. 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. A truly seismic geopolitical event.
I mean, it redefined the entire global power structure overnight. The sources show that in the aftermath, 15 Soviet republics gained independence. You're talking about countries like Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states.
All suddenly sovereign nations.
And Russia became the largest successor state. It inherited most of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, its permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and its core military-industrial complex.
And for a brief, sort of hopeful moment, the relationship shifted dramatically. The sources described the early 90s as a period of genuine hope for partnership. The U.S. stood as the sole global superpower.
And Russia, under new leadership with Boris Yeltsin, was struggling with this incredibly painful transition toward market economics. They often called it shock therapy.
But that hope,
it
didn't last long.
It eroded very quickly. The expansion of NATO eastward, bringing in former Warsaw Pact countries, began to be perceived by Russia, particularly by its security establishment, as a strategic encroachment, not a stabilizing factor.
A broken promise, in their view.
In their view, yes. This perceived humiliation and loss of influence after 91, you couple that with the internal political instability and economic chaos of the 90s, and it helped fuel the emergence of a new, much more assertive Russian leadership.
And the relationship since then has just been deeply volatile. I mean, you see cooperation on arms control, the International Space Station. But then you have these huge disagreements flaring up over the Balkans, interventions in the Middle East, and critically, what Russia views as interference in its near abroad.
Its sphere of influence.
Right. Actions in Georgia in 2008, and of course, more recently, Ukraine since 2014.
And if we connect this to the present day, the importance of this history is just. It's profound. The Cold War didn't just end. It left these deep, deep scars. The mistrust is inherent. The structural competition remains.
But it's not driven by communism anymore.
No, not at all. It's driven by Russia's focus on restoring what it sees as its rightful status as a great power and challenging what it views as a U.S.-dominated unipolar world order. This historical baggage informs every single diplomatic and military decision made today.
So that history of antagonism is it's compounded by the fact that the two nations operate on fundamentally incompatible political systems. When decisions get made in Washington and Moscow, they're made under vastly different sets of rules and constraints.
And we don't need to define basic civics here, but it's crucial to analyze the implications of these structures. The U.S. is a federal constitutional republic, and its defining feature is the dispersal of power.
The three branches.
Exactly. Executive, legislative, and judicial, with all these formalized checks and balances. Now, this structure makes U.S. foreign policy inherently slow, often messy, and very, very visible to the public.
And that slowness is often frustrating to allies, and sometimes even to the president. But it's, as they say, a feature, not a bug.
Right. It's designed specifically to prevent rapid unilateral shifts in policy. And on top of that, its foreign policy is explicitly built on promoting values-free speech, a protected press, democratic rights globally. That's a key source of its soft power, but it's also a major source of friction with more centralized states.
Okay, so now let's look at Russia. It is, technically, a federal republic with a semi-presidential system. But the reality of the power dynamics is dramatically different.
Dramatically. Power is deeply, deeply concentrated in the executive, and specifically within the presidency. Vladimir Putin has dominated the entire political landscape for over 2 decades.
And the sources document the mechanisms he's used to solidify that control. You have recent constitutional changes, for example, that reset his previous terms, allowing him to potentially stay in power until 2036.
That move essentially institutionalized personalized power. It's a fundamental shift.
And that centralization creates a different kind of operational capability.
A completely different one. While the U.S. president has to contend with a potentially hostile Congress, a powerful and independent judiciary, and a deeply entrenched and often adversarial free press, the Russian system is designed for speed and singular direction. And critics argue, with a lot of evidence, that this leads to an erosion of political freedom. The media is largely state-aligned, and sustaining genuine political opposition is extremely difficult.
Let's focus on that contrast in managing dissent. In the U.S., fierce political debate, even, aggressive opposition and protests, they're seen as integral to the system. They're protected.
In Russia, opposition is often treated not merely as a political challenge, but as a direct threat to national stability or even national security. The high-profile case of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who faced arrest and significant legal pressure, really illustrates this highly restrictive environment.
And the Russian government's justification.
They justify such actions as necessary to protect national interests against what they frame as destabilizing foreign influence.
But the implication for foreign policy is stark. A concentrated power structure allows Moscow to make fast, decisive, and often very risky geopolitical moves. You just have to think of the speed of the decision-making during the 2014 annexation of Crimea.
Right.
By contrast, a major U.S. foreign policy move often requires lengthy congressional approval, budget negotiations, public debate. It creates a much slower, more deliberative response mechanism.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these differences mean that when the two nations are out there trying to influence the global stage, say in Africa, the Middle East, or Latin America, they bring vastly different tool sets to the table.
How so?
The U.S. often offers aid that's conditional on democratic reforms or human rights improvements. Russia, on the other hand, might offer military equipment or energy deals with minimal, if any, political strings attached. And that appeals to nations that are wary of what they see as Western political interference.
So the political systems themselves are clashing constantly in these international forums.
All the time. At the UN, the U.S. might be pushing for resolutions on human rights or government transparency, which Russia then routinely vetoes or abstains from, arguing that they are just thinly veiled attempts to undermine Russia's sovereign interests or interfere in other nations' internal affairs.
So the competition isn't just political, it's philosophical.
It is. It's a continuous high-stakes contest to influence the global definition of what constitutes legitimate governance. Is it democracy and shared power, or is it stability and centralized authority? This ideological friction is what fuels so much of the enduring tension between Washington and Moscow.
Okay, let's move from political philosophy to military muscle.
Oh.
This is the realm of hard power. And the comparison of capabilities here reveals some profound asymmetries. It really starts with pure expenditure.
The data on military spending tells a very clear story of disproportionate global reach. The U.S. defense budget for 2024 is approaching $1 trillion.
A trillion.
It's a staggering figure. And it accounts for well over a third of the entire global military expenditure. This budget supports 1.3 million active service members, a highly professional, all-volunteer force, and crucially, an unparalleled global logistical network.
That logistical network is so often the unseen advantage, isn't it? We're talking about massive transport aircraft fleets, global satellite communications, specialized command structures.
All of which allows the U.S. to deploy personnel and equipment literally anywhere in the world within days. That, right there, is the definition of a global power.
So how does Russia's budget compare?
It's far smaller, even with significant recent increases. It's hovering around $150 billion. They maintain a larger overall force structure, about 1.1 million active duty troops plus substantial reserves, but they rely much more heavily on conscription and, a lot of older, though still effective platforms.
The spending gap is massive. That's nearly 8-to-1.
It is.
But if Russia is spending nearly 8 times less than the U.S., shouldn't we just view their military strength as fundamentally secondary? I mean, how can they effectively challenge U.S. global dominance with that kind of disparity?
And that's the critical insight. They can't. Russia cannot and does not try to match the U.S. in conventional global power projection. Their entire strategy is designed to bypass that competition altogether.
Oh.
They focus on two key areas. Number one, nuclear parity, and number two, asymmetric conventional capabilities that are designed to neutralize U.S. and NATO technological superiority, but regionally.
Okay, let's start with the nuclear edge, where parity remains the cornerstone of that MAID stability we talked about.
Right. So our sources indicate that Russia maintains a slightly higher total stockpile of nuclear warheads, somewhere over 5,400 compared to the U.S.'s 5,100.
But the key number isn't the total, is it?
No, the key number is the deployed strategic warheads. These are the ones ready for immediate launch on intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines, and bombers. And here the counts are roughly equal, around 1,700 warheads each.
Which means MAD is still fully in effect.
Absolutely. Both nations maintain a sophisticated nuclear triad: ICBMs, SLBMs, that's submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. This ensures that a catastrophic retaliatory strike is always possible.
Okay, so then the conventional asymmetry is where things get really fascinating. The U.S. excels in these advanced platforms. Stealth aircraft like the F-35, a network of powerful aircraft carriers.
11 of them currently in operation. Nobody else is even close.
And a dominant presence in the oceans with their nuclear submarine fleet. The U.S. doctrine prioritizes network-centric warfare, where all these components are linked digitally for maximum precision and coordination.
And Russia's focus is on what military analysts call A2AD capabilities. That stands for anti-accessoria denial. They possess some of the world's most advanced surface-to-air missile systems, like the S-400 and soon the S-500.
And what are those designed to do?
They're designed specifically to deny air superiority to NATO aircraft over key regions, to create a bubble that is just too dangerous to fly in. They also rely heavily on massive long-range artillery power and are investing very aggressively in next-generation platforms.
And those next-generation platforms, that's where we get into hypersonic missiles, which are apparently changing the whole strategic equation.
They absolutely are. And Russia has been a pioneer here. They are actively fielding systems like the Kinzhal missile and the Avangard glide vehicle. These things travel at 5 to 10 times the speed of sound.
And they can maneuver.
And they can maneuver during flight. That's the key. It makes them almost impossible to intercept with our current missile defense systems. These weapons are designed to undermine the U.S. advantage in missile defense and ensure that Russia retains its ability to hold U.S. and allied targets at risk, despite that huge budget gap.
The strategic distinction in global reach is also just. It's obvious when you look at a map. The U.S. maintains a network of over 700 military bases in more than 70 countries. This infrastructure makes it a global security guarantor. It allows it to quickly project power into the Persian Gulf, the Pacific, Europe, anywhere.
And Russia's military posture is, by necessity, much more regionally focused. They primarily concentrate power on their periphery in Eastern Europe, in the Arctic, and at their primary foreign operational base in Syria. While Russia can deploy forces globally, its main focus is securing its borders and challenging NATO influence in its immediate vicinity.
This focus on its near abroad brings us directly to modern tactics, specifically this concept of hybrid warfare.
Yes, and our sources detail how Russia has become extremely proficient at this combined strategy. Hybrid warfare is the integration of conventional military pressure with non-kinetic tools.
So not just guns and bombs.
Right. This includes leveraging cyber attacks to disrupt infrastructure, using disinformation campaigns via state media, employing little green men, those are the unmarked special forces like we saw in Crimea, and conducting economic coercion. It deliberately blurs the lines between peace and conflict, which makes traditional deterrence models much less effective.
And the most critical, continuous engagement happens in what people call the cyber shadow war. Both sides are deeply invested here. The U.S. has the National Security Agency, the NSA, and Cyber Command operating continuously against Russian intelligence agencies.
Yes, specifically the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, and the FSB, which handles domestic security and counterintelligence. They are constantly targeting critical infrastructure, elections, military networks on both sides. This is an essential, invisible arena of conflict that runs 24/7.
And for Russia, it's a perfect asymmetric tool.
It's perfect for them. It allows Russia to project power and sow discord globally without triggering a conventional military response. It's the very embodiment of their asymmetric strategy.
One final point on strategy that the sources kept highlighting. The Arctic. It's becoming a rapidly militarized zone.
Yeah, it is. As the ice melts, new shipping lanes are opening up, and access to vast, untapped resources, oil, gas, minerals, becomes feasible. Russia has the longest Arctic coastline by far, and they are aggressively building up their northern fleet, refurbishing old Soviet-era air bases, and launching a new fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers.
And the U.S. response?
The U.S. is responding, increasing naval patrols and strengthening bases in Alaska and Norway. It is a slow-motion strategic competition over geography and resources that will likely define future maritime dominance for decades to come.
So to sum it up, the rivalry is asymmetric. The U.S. dominates in budgets, technology, and global reach. Russia compensates through nuclear parity, targeted advanced weapon systems like hypersonics, and a deep expertise in unconventional hybrid warfare.
And all that military power requires an economic engine to sustain it. When we compare the economies of the U.S. and Russia, the disparity is arguably even greater than the military gap, and this creates very unique levers of influence for both sides.
The U.S. is just this colossal global economic engine. Its GDP is over $26 trillion. It's the largest, most diversified economy in history. And this economy isn't reliant on a single sector. It spans cutting-edge technology, aerospace, financial services, vast agricultural production. U.S. corporations, the Apples, the Googles, the Teslas, they don't just participate in global capitalism. They practically define its rules.
Russia's economy, in sharp contrast, is far, far smaller. It's hovering somewhere between $1.7 and $2 trillion in GDP, and its structure is highly centralized and, frankly, alarmingly undiversified.
It all comes down to natural resources.
It does. Its entire economic health rests heavily on the export of natural resources. Oil, natural gas, and essential metals account for the vast majority of its exports and a huge portion of its government revenue.
And that commodity dependence is a real double-edged sword. On one hand, Russia is the world's top exporter of natural gas and a major oil producer, which gives it massive energy leverage, particularly over Europe and Asia, who have historically relied on Russian pipelines for heat and power.
And that leverage is an incredibly powerful geopolitical tool. We saw this very clearly when Russia leveraged gas supplies in response to sanctions, which drove up energy prices globally.
But as you noted, that same resource dependence makes Russia highly vulnerable to external factors.
Extremely. Volatility in global oil prices can derail their entire national budget almost instantly. And crucially, it makes them a clear target for sanctions that can directly attack their key revenue streams.
Which brings us to financial warfare. The core of U.S. global influence isn't really the number of aircraft carriers it has, it's the power of the dollar.
The U.S. dollar is the world's primary reserve currency. It's a legacy of the post-WWII order. This means most international trade from buying oil in Saudi Arabia to selling iPhones from China is denominated in dollars.
And that status gives the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. banking system just immense control over global finance.
Immense. Cutting a country off from the dollar-denominated system, especially by denying them access to SWIFT, which is the global financial messaging system, is one of the most potent forms of non-military power the U.S. possesses.
So when we talk about sanctions, what we're really talking about is weaponizing the global financial architecture that the U.S. helped create.
That's a perfect way to put it. And since 2014, and especially since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Western nations have imposed these incredibly stringent sanctions on Russian banks, energy companies, and key individuals.
And what's going to be the impact?
The sources detail a very significant impact. They have frozen hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian foreign reserves held abroad. They've crippled major state-owned enterprises. And, critically, they've severely limited Russia's access to Western high-technology microchips, advanced machinery, software, all of which is crucial for long-term economic modernization.
So it has slowed their growth.
Demonstrably. And it's made resource extraction more difficult and more expensive. But Russia isn't just passively accepting this. They have implemented a multi-pronged strategy to reduce their vulnerability, which is often called de-dollarization.
They're not trying to get out from under the thumb of the dollar.
Precisely. They are actively seeking new trade partners, with China becoming their #1 economic lifeline, accepting payment for energy in rubles or yuan. They're also building up massive gold reserves and seeking to route financial transactions outside the traditional SWIFT system, often using domestic equivalents or direct bilateral currency swaps.
It's a calculated attempt to insulate their economy.
It is, but it's a very long, very slow, and very difficult process.
The contrast in innovation also seems to strengthen the U.S. long-term position. The U.S. just dominates R&D in the fields that are critical to the future: AI, biotechnology, advanced computing.
And that technological leadership translates directly into massive long-term economic growth potential. It also reinforces U.S. soft power. While Russia has pockets of deep expertise, particularly in military hardware and certain areas of mathematics and software, its commercial innovation engine is simply not comparable.
American movies, apps, cultural trends, they shape global consumption.
And they shape political outlooks, which reinforces global alignment with Western values.
Yet Russia still retains some powerful niche influence. Even with its limited diversification, its control over agricultural exports, we're talking especially grain and fertilizer, gives it significant leverage, particularly when global food supply chains are stressed.
Yes, and this ability to influence the daily lives of millions, even with a smaller economy, ensures its continued relevance in global markets. It's a key tool for them, particularly in Africa and the Middle East.
So ultimately, the U.S. uses its economic supremacy to structure the international order, rewarding compliance and punishing divergence.
And Russia uses its resource wealth and its pursuit of de-dollarization to challenge that order, trying to build parallel economic structures with nations like China and Iran, who share that desire to reduce Western financial influence.
So economic stability is the engine, but diplomacy and alliances are the transmission. They're what converts that economic and military power into actual global movement. And here again, we see vastly different networks that the U.S. and Russia operate within.
The U.S. diplomatic framework is built on these vast, enduring, multilateral networks constructed since World War II. The single most important pillar, of course, is NATO.
An alliance of 31 member states.
And it functions as the primary military deterrent against Russian aggression in Europe. It provides a level of collective security that is far, far greater than the sum of its individual parts. An attack on one is an attack on all.
And beyond just NATO, the U.S. remains the chief architect and primary funder of many key international institutions: the UN, the World Bank, the IMF.
And its leadership role in those institutions allows it to set the rules, influence global development lending, and shape international norms across law and human rights. It's a huge source of structural power.
And then there are the bilateral ties.
Yes, beyond the multilateral structures, the U.S. maintains these incredibly strong bilateral security treaties across the Pacific with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia through the ANZ-US alliance. These relationships, built on shared values of democracy and trade, give the U.S. unparalleled reach into Asia and the Pacific, which is crucial for its rivalry with both Russia and, increasingly, China.
Russia's diplomatic approach, on the other hand, it seems to focus on regional counterbalance to Western dominance and cultivating these strategic partnerships with powers that are also hostile to the U.S.
That's the core of it. Russia's regional blocs are key. It leads the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which is a military alliance of several former Soviet republics.
A kind of mini NATO.
It was designed on the NATO model, yes, but the sources indicate it suffers from a lot of internal political friction, and it lacks the integrated command structure and, frankly, the funding of its Western counterpart. Russia also manages the Eurasian Economic Union, which promotes economic integration, but struggles to match the influence of the EU.
And these regional efforts are explicitly designed to contain Western influence and maintain a sphere of influence in what Russia calls its near abroad.
Absolutely. And the strategic ties outside that region are also vital. Russia has developed very close relationships with China, what they've called the No Limits Partnership, as well as with Iran and Syria.
And these are pragmatic relationships.
Very pragmatic. They are united by a shared desire to challenge or at least limit U.S. global power. Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war, for example, supporting the Assad regime, directly challenged U.S. foreign policy, and it cemented Russia's role as an indispensable power broker in the Middle East.
Let's talk about soft power, the ability to influence without force or money. The U.S. seems to excel here through its cultural output and educational exchanges.
It does. The U.S. uses tools like the Fulbright program, which funds foreign students and scholars to study in the U.S. And this creates these long-term cultural links and helps shape future global leadership toward American values and perspectives. And of course, it's cultural products. Hollywood, pop music, tech brands are consumed globally, shaping perceptions of prosperity and freedom.
Russia's soft power is much more limited, and it often centers on, well, information warfare.
That's right. Russia uses its state-run media outlets like RT and Sputnik, which broadcast in multiple languages all over the world. These outlets disseminate Russian government narratives, and they often emphasize perceived Western hypocrisy or promote specific viewpoints on issues like NATO expansion or U.S. elections.
And while Western sources often label it as propaganda or disinformation.
It's a calculated diplomatic tool. It's aimed at fostering skepticism toward Western media and institutions, and it's particularly effective in countries outside the NATO sphere.
And the one mechanism that was designed for global cooperation, the UN Security Council, it frequently just becomes the arena for gridlock.
Because as permanent members, both the U.S. and Russia hold veto power.
Which means nothing can pass without their consent.
Exactly. Neither can be forced to support a resolution it opposes. And this has led to just complete diplomatic paralysis on critical issues, from the wars in Syria and Ukraine to interventions in Africa. The system ensures that global action is often blocked by the rivalry itself.
Yet despite all this, the high level of mistrust, the constant competition dialogue does persist on critical, shared existential threats.
And that is the essential insight to hold on to. Diplomacy isn't always about friendship. In fact, it's often about managing hostility to prevent a catastrophe.
Like with arms control.
The continuation and the previous extensions of the New START treaty on nuclear weapons is a testament to this necessity. Even the deepest of rivals must talk about arms control, about cybersecurity norms, about avoiding collisions in space. The dialogue itself, even when it's strained and hostile, is a vital mechanism for global stability.
So the historical roots, the political incompatibility, the asymmetric military strengths, the economic warfare, and these competing alliances. They all pretty much guarantee that the U.S.-Russia relationship is going to remain one of the most critical dynamics in global politics for the foreseeable future. But looking ahead, where does that rivalry intersect with absolute necessity?
The enduring tension is a given, but there are areas where cooperation is simply non-negotiable for global security and, frankly, human survival, regardless of the political disagreements. And the first one that comes to mind is climate change, particularly focused on the Arctic.
Right. Both nations share long coastlines there, huge scientific interest, and of course, massive untapped oil and gas reserves. A shared challenge if ever there was one.
The rapid changes in the Arctic require joint scientific efforts to monitor ice melt, to manage fishing stocks, to ensure the safety of these newly opening shipping lanes. Responsible policy is vital. If they allow geopolitical competition to completely derail environmental management in the Arctic, the consequences for the rest of the world will be severe.
The rivalry has to yield to practicality at some point.
It has to. And then there is the issue that always looms largest: nuclear arms control. The New START treaty is central, but it's constantly under threat.
So future dialogue is critical.
Future dialogue and, more importantly, mutual transparency are absolutely vital. Both countries are modernizing their arsenals. If transparency mechanisms like reciprocal inspections and data exchange, if those break down completely, we risk a return to a completely unregulated arms race.
And that lack of predictability, that's the real danger.
It changes the global risk calculation dramatically.
Yeah.
Maintaining arms control dialogue is about managing deterrence, not about eliminating the rivalry.
And then you have cybersecurity and the proliferation of AI, which present this whole new layer of risk that outpaces all the existing treaties.
This is perhaps the most unpredictable frontier. Both nations possess advanced offensive cyber capabilities. And the potential for miscalculation or interference in critical infrastructure, power grids, financial networks, it grows exponentially as AI enhances these capabilities.
So we need new rules of the road.
We desperately need them. Establishing international norms for digital diplomacy, defining what constitutes an act of cyber war, creating red lines. It is essential to prevent a conflict that starts digitally and escalates conventionally.
Despite the current diplomatic freeze, there's also that long-standing tradition of cooperation in space exploration.
Right. The International Space Station, the ISS, has been a constant collaboration for decades. It's a testament that high-stakes scientific cooperation can survive periods of intense political friction on the ground.
So future missions could be a way to rebuild trust.
Potentially. Future endeavors, particularly focused on lunar and Martian missions, they offer a non-political mechanism to rebuild some small measure of trust and maintain professional communication channels between the space agencies and even the militaries of both nations.
And finally, we have to consider the elephant in the geopolitical room, the rise of China.
The emergence of China as a true third global power fundamentally alters the competitive environment for both the U.S. and Russia. It changes the whole board.
For the U.S., China is increasingly seen as the long-term systemic challenger.
Right, which could potentially divert U.S. military and diplomatic resources and attention away from Europe and the Middle East and focus them on the Pacific.
And for Russia?
Well, Russia is increasingly reliant on China, both economically and diplomatically, to counter Western sanctions, but they also have to be very wary of becoming a junior partner in that relationship, of losing their own strategic autonomy.
So the big question is how this three-body problem plays out.
That's the great strategic question for the future. Will this pressure from China force the U.S. and Russia to pivot? Will they move away from direct confrontation and seek temporary strategic partnerships to navigate this changing world order? Or is the historical mistrust just too great to allow for that kind of flexibility? That dynamic will shape the next 50 years.
So what does all this mean for you? We've cut through the noise today to establish that the rivalry is driven by two fundamentally incompatible political systems, by asymmetrical military strengths. You have U.S. technological dominance versus Russian nuclear parity and hybrid tactics, and by these economic leverage points centered on the power of the U.S. dollar versus Russian energy.
And I think the most valuable takeaway here is that true global stability hinges not just on avoiding direct conflict, but on managing the inevitable rivalry. Understanding the specific tools each power uses, from the UN veto to hypersonic missiles to state-run media, that's the pathway to becoming a truly informed global citizen who can distinguish between strategic posturing and a genuine existential threat.
We've established that both countries are deeply engaged in proxy conflicts, and they're utilizing these asymmetrical tactics like disinformation and cyber warfare to achieve their geopolitical goals without triggering MAD, without triggering that nuclear exchange. And these engagements, they allow them to expand influence, but it comes at the cost of prolonging global instability and humanitarian crises in places like Syria and Ukraine.
So, given the evidence in the source material that both the U.S. and Russia are intensely focused on protecting their core national security interests, and that they're heavily investing in these indirect, asymmetrical tactics where the lines between war and peace are constantly blurred, does the greatest potential for escalation lie not in a sudden direct confrontation, but in a continued, unchecked reliance on these proxy conflicts and asymmetric tools in the future, ultimately making global stability a kind of constant, low-grade, simmering crisis?
That is the complex question we leave you with today. Thank you for joining us for this essential deep dive.
Keep learning, stay curious, and keep connecting the dots.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.